So let's go through the top 7 takeaways from Roy Moore's defeat in Alabama, what conservatives should really learn. Number 1, no, Roy Moore should not have dropped out of this race after the sexual impropriety allegations came out. There are a lot of Republicans saying now, oh, he should have dropped out. There should have been a write-in candidate against Doug Jones. We could have run Luther Strange or Mo Brooks or somebody. Not true. Totally ridiculous. Let's look at the timeline. On November 9th, that is when the first allegations against Roy Moore came out. Keep in mind, these are 40-year-old allegations. But on November 9th, we learned that there is a woman who says that when she was 14, Roy Moore was sexually inappropriate with her, he sexually assaulted her. And then a number of other women came out and said, oh, yes, when I was 16 or 18 or 19, Roy Moore, then at the time 30, 32, he got a little frisky with me too, and it created this aura of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Those were the allegations. These allegations were conveniently timed. You notice you haven't heard about these things for, I don't know, the 40 years since they happened until just too late for Roy Moore to get off that ballot. So people think it's very easy. If Roy Moore just dropped out, then they'd put someone else on the ballot and the Republican would have won. That isn't true. According to Alabama state code, you can only remove yourself from the ballot 76 days before the election. So if it's after that time period, you can't get off of the ballot. If Roy Moore had dropped out, his name would still be on that ballot. He still would have the Republican line. Some people also don't know, when you're running for office, you need to get a number of lines. So, for instance, when I would run campaigns in New York, we'd try to pick up the Republican line, the Conservative line, the Independence Party line. There are all these, the Democrats would get Working Families Party. But you get those lines, and then the more lines you have, the better your chances of winning. If Roy Moore had dropped out and the Republican establishment or Donald Trump even had endorsed someone like Luther Strange, who had lost in the primaries, or Mo Brooks, who didn't really have much of a shot, even though those candidates would have been more likely to win the general, it would have had to be a write-in campaign. So there's a very low chance it would have happened. I think Luther Strange was polling at like 2% or something in a write-in campaign in the general election. Roy Moore dropping out would have guaranteed the seat would have gone to a Democrat, instead of what we saw, which was a tight race, but, 2-3 points separating these. It was a clear outcome, basically, but at least a close race. Dropping out would have guaranteed it to Democrats. And I know what you're going to hear. You're going to hear, well, Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, she won a write-in campaign in 2010. It is completely different. She had a lot of things going for her. One, she had enormous support, which Roy Moore lacked. She was an incumbent. She already had the seat. She already had universal name recognition. She came from a political legacy family. She was widely known as the heir to a political family, and she had a political write-in campaign. So her entire campaign was about this write-in. She gave out bracelets. She instructed people on how to spell her name. It was just too late. There was a month till the election when these allegations surfaced. It couldn't have happened. Added to all of this, you had Steve Bannon inserting himself into the Roy Moore campaign and playing it as an anti-establishment versus establishment campaign. So had Donald Trump come out and endorsed the guy who lost the Republican primary or someone else, it would have been seen widely as opposing the will of voters, opposing the will of the populace. And for a populist president to do that, it just can't happen. At the end of this election, it was a choice between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. Anybody who's trying to tell you otherwise is selling you a fantasy. Number 2, no, the outcome is not stunning. The mainstream media will tell you it's stunning, it's unbelievable. To hear them tell it, not since the Battle of Lepanto has an underdog overcome so much to get a victory. NBC News reported it's a stunning victory. Politico reported on the Alabama earthquake. The Washington Post, Democracy Dies in Darkness, called it miraculous. They're suggesting no one could have ever predicted this. This is a blowout victory. Did anybody predict that Roy Moore would lose the general? Let's cut to the tape.
Luther will definitely win. No? You know what I'm saying. Roy has a very good chance of not winning in the general election. It's all about the general. Don't forget, we don't stop here. You have an election coming up the day this is over. So this is over on Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, the new race begins. You got to beat a Democrat. Luther's going to win easily. And Roy's going to have a hard time winning.
Oh, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the guy who predicted this, right? The leader of Roy Moore's party, the Republican president, he predicted that Roy Moore would have a very hard time. He likely wouldn't win the general election. The mainstream media are conveniently ignoring this today because they need this to seem like a seismic shift. They need this to show that all of the Republican momentum, all of the Trump momentum, conservative policy legislation like we haven't seen in our lifetimes is coming to an end. They have to show that it stops that. Donald Trump predicted it during the primary. He said, yeah, I don't know, this guy, it's going to be a tough race for him. He isn't a great candidate. He's a flawed candidate. This was before any of the sexual allegations came out. Just based on his appeal as a candidate, absent the dirty tricks, absent people coming out of the woodwork to accuse him of things, he knew it would be a tough race. This isn't stunning. Stop repeating that. Number 3, Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment, now more than ever. Ronald Reagan was fond of saying, there is an 11th commandment we all must live by, thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican. Unfortunately, many Republicans were all too happy to jump on the bandwagon against Roy Moore when these accusations came out. In part, perhaps, because the going got a little tough. That is a bad accusation to say that a man in his 30s is creeping on 14-year-old girls. And so when the going gets tough, you want to run away from that. Also, I think people just don't like Moore. Some Republicans don't like him because of his Trumpiness. They don't like him because he's a Bible thumper. They don't like him because he seems a little slick, a little unctuous, whatever. Do not speak ill of a fellow Republican. Because, by the way, this sexual mania that took over the last days of the Roy Moore campaign, they had one piece of solid evidence. Gloria Allred showed it off with that one accuser during her big press conference. It was a yearbook that purported to have a signature from Roy Moore saying sweet things to the little girl. We now know, it has been admitted, that that evidence was at least partially fabricated, and they hid that it was fabricated when they showed it. So the only hard evidence we have is not credible. And yet, Republicans were quick to throw Roy Moore under the bus instead of saying nothing at all, instead of stepping back a little bit and saying, well, let's wait and see how this plays out. I'm not totally sure, because now there's a precedent, which is if you make allegations, sexual allegations in particular, against a Republican, you will be assumed guilty until proven innocent. Not a good way for Republicans to move forward. It really damages us. Hopefully we'll learn not to be so quick on the trigger in the future. Number 4, Republicans need better opposition research. This is the part where I talk about how the allegations were pretty strong. So these allegations, sure, they were 40 years old, but we know from Moore's autobiography that he has a thing for young teenage girls. We know from Moore's 2005 autobiography that he met his current wife when she was a teenager performing in a dance recital. He wrote, quote, I knew Kayla was going to be a special person in my life. And then later, when she was 23, I think they connected and went on a date. That's how the story goes. Nevertheless, he even admitted that when she was a teenage girl in a dance recital, he had the eye for her. So Roy Moore's opponents should have known, his Republican opponents should have known, this was a place rife for attack. Even if all of the allegations were false, they would be easy political tricks to play. Roy Moore's campaign should have protected against that, and Luther Strange's campaign should have pounced on it. If these allegations are true, they should have found those people, and they should have made them make the claims during the primary so that Strange would have won, and we would have a Republican in the Senate from Alabama. If those claims weren't true, Roy Moore should have protected against that. It means that Luther Strange's campaign was incompetent. I don't believe this was a big conspiracy, really, by the establishment. I don't really buy that Mitch McConnell knew about this and he was sitting on it and hiding it. I think if they had been sitting on it, they would have played it in the primary. They don't want to lose that seat. They could have easily bumped out Roy Moore and given it to Luther Strange if this had come out. Republican voting was deeply depressed in the general election. They easily could have defeated Roy Moore in a primary and depressed his supporters in that election, but they didn't do it. I don't know if it's that we're lazy because we've been running against the Clintons, for whom every scandal of the last 3 decades is common public knowledge. It's been plastered all over TV for years and years and years, but you have to get better at opposition research. I place a lot of the blame for this loss at Luther Strange's feet and at his campaign because they didn't uncover this and Moore didn't protect against it. Number 5, do not OD on covfefe. Covfefe is a hell of a drug, folks. You've got to use it sparingly and cautiously. What I mean by that, there is a huge right-wing exuberance, more than I have ever seen in my entire life. A young life, granted, but, I've been on this earth a few decades at least, and we've never seen anything like this. Wonderful conservative legislation, wonderful executive priorities, wonderful foreign policy, good judges being nominated, courts being stacked. We're seeing massive tax reform that we haven't seen since Reagan. But there is a limit. There is a limit. You can't go crazy. Donald Trump has completely shaken up politics. He's radically altered what is acceptable specifically in political speech, in campaign speech, in what a candidate looks like. He's cracked this political correct, gross, just the political language where they say one thing and really that they're lying, but they're lying in this way or they're lying in that way. Donald Trump, he cracked that. He cracked the political correctness. He cracked the credibility of the mainstream media. But you can't get away with everything. He hasn't abolished the rules of politics entirely. Roy Moore did not have a way forward. He did not know how to pivot his campaign. He gave this awful interview with Sean Hannity. Let's hear it.
Do you know Miss Korfman? Do you know the mother?
I don't know Miss Korfman from anybody. I've never talked to her, never had any contact with her. Allegations of sexual misconduct with her are completely false. I believe they're politically motivated. I believe they're brought only to stop a very successful campaign, and that's what they're doing. I've never known this woman or anything with regard to the other girls. You understand this is 40 years ago.
She said that you asked her out on the first of several dates, but nothing progressed beyond kissing.
I don't remember specific dates. No, I do not. And I don't remember if it was that time or later, but I do not remember that. No.
But you know her, but you never dated her ever. Is that what you're saying?
Know her, but I don't remember going out on dates. I knew her as a friend. If we did go out on dates, then we did, but I do not remember that.
That is not an answer. So he's talking about two different girls there, but he's saying on the one, this never happened, this 14-year-old girl, it never happened. Well, did you date teenagers? Well, no, I don't remember specific dates. Well, did you date teenagers? Well, that's not an answer. If you're going to deny it, deny it. If you're going to own up to it and explain it, but move on, pivot, move on. The way that Roy Moore tried to pivot was by blaming gays and lesbians and the cultural left for harping on this. Sure, the cultural left might be harping on this. You're not going to be able to push your campaign forward by trying to scapegoat gays and lesbians when your own sexual behavior is being called into question. You have to move forward. Roy Moore didn't do that. He didn't have a clear enough vision for his campaign, and he didn't have the courage or the strength or the political smarts to address the issue and move straight forward, plow right by it. This brings us to number 6. Never defend, never explain, always attack. This is also from Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would say, if you're explaining, you're losing. But Roy Moore just kept on explaining. He kept on saying, well, I never did this 40 years ago, and even when I did, I got the mother's permission. That doesn't work, pal. When you do that, you end up looking like Frank from Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
I am not going to diddle your kids. I'm not like that. We got to definitely write a song about how we do not diddle kids. Do not diddle kids. It's no good diddling kids.
There is no quicker way for people to think that you are diddling kids than by writing a song about it.
You got to write a song that says, ooh, I wouldn't do it with anybody younger than my daughter. No little kids. Got to be big. Older than my wife. Younger than my daughter. Something like that.
Don't write a song about that.
No, I'm cloudy. I got a headache.
That could be a documentary of Roy Moore's campaign. That is what it looked like when he came out and tried to explain all of this. Don't do that. Eventually, he wised up and then just denied it. He called into question some of the, clearly the fabrication on the yearbook signature. But that's what he looked like for weeks when these allegations came out. Not a good look. There's no way to convince somebody that you're not doing that when you're constantly harping on these things and going back and changing your story slightly. When Republicans were confronted with various and sundry allegations against Moore, they would say, if you even support Moore, you are a pedophile. There is a 2-word answer that they should have given: Bob Menendez. Bob Menendez, there is a sitting Democrat United States Senator who federal prosecutors think might have had sex with underage prostitutes. You don't hear a peep about that. You don't hear Democrats calling on him to step down or to resign. The mainstream media have blocked it out entirely because it doesn't help out their narrative against Republicans and against Roy Moore. But that's what they said. The Democrats said, well, if you vote for Moore, you are a pedophile. And just to be precise about language here, what Roy Moore is accused of is not pedophilia. The old Greek word for this is ephebophilia. He's accused of doing things, weird sex stuff with teenagers, young teenage girls, but not with children. There's a difference between a 6-year-old and a 16-year-old, for instance. I guess you could make that point to them, but the real attack you have to make is pushing forward, pushing it back on them. Say, not only are your claims not true, not only is your evidence of the yearbook, which was fabricated, not even is that not credible, but your own guy is sitting in the United States Senate accused of having sex with underage prostitutes, Senator Bob Menendez, and you're saying nothing on that. And until Democrats answer for that, they have no credibility on this issue, and you don't owe them one single explanation. Beyond that, political votes are, when I vote for somebody, I do not suddenly take on all of their moral characteristics. That's not how it works. We live in reality. And in reality, we have to elect people to represent us on political issues in legislative bodies. I do not become Chuck Schumer because Chuck Schumer represents the state of New York. I do not become Kamala Harris because Kamala Harris represents California. I don't even become Donald Trump because I voted for Donald Trump in the presidential election. I don't have billions of dollars. I don't have the kind of crazy hair. That doesn't happen because there are steps between the representatives and their constituents. Don't buy into that lie and hammer them, hammer them, hammer them. Have I made myself clear? I hope so. Next and final point, do not get hypnotized. This one's really hard because the mainstream media will do this to you. According to a report out from the Media Research Center today, 91% of evening news coverage about Donald Trump is negative. 91%. This is way higher than previous presidents, Republican or Democrat. There is wall-to-wall coverage of all of the sex stuff with Roy Moore. And what's the refrain? Roy Moore is a pedophile. Roy Moore is a pedophile. It doesn't really analyze the evidence. It doesn't analyze what those words mean. It doesn't analyze what the accusations are or how many decades ago they took place. But do not be hypnotized. I know you haven't seen anything about Bob Menendez. I know all you've heard about is what a mean, terrible, rotten guy Roy Moore is. But the mainstream media are the communications wing of the Democratic Party. Do not believe what they're saying. There have been absurd retractions in just the last few days from CNN, Washington Post, the New York Times. They got stories completely wrong. Important stories about so-called collusion, about the White House, about Donald Trump. Don't buy what they are selling and don't buy their premises because then you'll have to arrive at their conclusions. That isn't true.